Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
This week we were at... What was the name of that place we were at?
Notice how long it takes Anthony to remember, because all of a sudden, Ant and I are back out on the road, and when we're on the road, we do lots of dates, and when we do lots of dates, we forget where we are.
We were in Shelby, North Carolina.
Yeah, Shelby.
Interviewing Corey DeAngelis about school choice. In keeping with the spirit of that, I was looking up median salaries for college-educated versus high school-educated workers and discovered some interesting things. When we talk to high school students, we make it a point of saying that what matters isn't a college degree, but the college major. The return on a college major ranges from as low as less than a high school diploma to as high as $7 million. What I found interesting was an article recently from NPR listing several occupations that do not require four-year degrees and that pay substantially more than the median college graduate earns.
If I know what you're going to be talking about, all of these things are going to be 2/3 ahead of college majors.
I'm going to give a range of things here, but they range up to twice as much as what the median college graduate earns. As we talk about college graduates, four-year degree only, not master's, not PhD, just four-year degree. The median four-year degree holder earns currently $61,000. So that's the guy in the middle. So let's jump from the $61,000 to $63,000. That's the median income for construction and building inspectors, and those jobs require a high school diploma or equivalent. That's it. They're earning more than the median college graduate. Respiratory therapists earn $63,000. Cardiovascular technologists and technicians earn $70,000. Dental hygienists, they require an associate's degree. That's a 2-year degree, but they make a median of $77,000. Radiation therapists, also requiring a 2-year degree, make $87,000. Elevator and escalator installers and repairers don't require any degree whatsoever. Median income, $88,000. Airline and commercial pilots, as well as air traffic controllers, don't require 4-year degrees, and they earn over $130,000. More than twice what the median college graduate earns.
It's kind of interesting how these sorts of careers actually are very well paying, and generally speaking, the people who have them are pretty happy. Now, I think this is not true of air traffic controllers. I think they're under a lot of strain. But for most of these things, people go to work, they do their job, they go home, and unlike you and me and many other people, they leave their work at work.
Right.
You have a son and I have a son who are very likely going nowhere near a traditional college.
Right.
I'm fine with that. Go with God. Do what makes you happy. If that happens to be an electrician, well, go be one. There's no shame in that, and people behave as if there were.
They behave as if they were, which is really odd because we have spent so long pushing our children into college that there are plenty of jobs that don't require college educations for which we're hurting for workers. All those jobs I just mentioned, this data comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, are showing remarkable growth in demand. And it doesn't cost you whatever it is, $60,000 to $100,000 for a 4-year education to do those jobs.
If your aptitude runs in that direction, well, good for you. You're going to have a very easy time of it. And people who major in English or poetry or communications or sociology, they're not going to make near what these people make in the trades. From the perspective of a sometime college professor and a full-time college professor, I say go with God. You're doing things that make you happy. You're making a nice living. Go right ahead.
If you'd like to look at the data yourself, we'll include a link to the Bureau of Labor Statistics site in the show notes, and you can scroll through and see the details on many occupations, what educational requirements they have, and what the median salaries are.
And I've got 2 obvious candidates for Foolishness of the Week here this week. This happens a lot. You whittle it down to 2 stories, and they compete neck and neck for the Foolishness of the Week. This week, the not foolishness of the week is a young man named Loza Alexander, who has written a hip-hop song about a race car driver. Typically, the hip-hop people and the race car people are not the same people. That's not how this works. But he has written a song called Let's Go Brandon. Again, hip-hop guys not really used to using the name Brandon. That's not a hip-hop name. But young Loza has caught some lightning in a bottle here, and he wrote his song as a sort of nod to Donald Trump. If you listen very carefully, and you can listen very carefully because we're going to include this crazy link in the show notes for you. If you listen very carefully, you will hear a lot of people saying a very bad thing about Joe Biden. And here I realize that I sound kind of like you when a sport of any kind is mentioned. I have no earthly clue why anybody wants to watch people drive around in a circle.
Well, I apply that thought to all sports, but my understanding is NASCAR is counted by, I don't know whether it's revenue or attendees or whatever it is, but apparently it's by far the number one sport in the United States.
Yeah, maybe, and that's only because you can get so many people into the stadium. But if you think that it rivals the NFL in any serious way, that's crazy.
Yeah, well,
right?
You just spawned a bunch of hate mail from NASCAR fans.
And believe it or not, that is not the foolishness of the week. Those nice people at the British Museum, and I have been to the British Museum, it is chock full of all the best plunder that they ever stole from anybody. It's amazing. When I stood there 2 feet away from the Rosetta Stone, I thought, well, we've done something interesting right here, haven't we? And something came out of the archives, I guess you would call it. It's a carving on a slab of stone. I believe it was marble. It's the oldest representation of a ghost in art. It's 3,500 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. And here's the shocker for you. No such thing as ghosts. But I find it deeply fascinating that this was found. And I think it's even more interesting that 3,500 years later, we haven't really gotten around this one yet.
It seems to me that should give you some pause, because the argument you just made and dismissed is the same argument that I made and you applaud me for making as to why we have government. That is, it's persisted throughout human history, which tells me there's something there. But so too with the ghosts.
It's human psychology, I think, on both counts.
I don't know the answer to it.
I think that's right.
All I could say is, if there were nothing to it, it would have died out. To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. We should take a moment to mention Words and Numbers is a weekly podcast. James, a political scientist, and I, an economist, take a nonpartisan look at current events. This week, we're recording live at the Classical Liberals in the Carolinas annual conference in beautiful Shelby, North Carolina. We're also appearing on C19 TV with Cleveland Community College. This week, Corey DeAngelis joins us. Corey is National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children and Executive Director at the Educational Freedom Institute. His research focuses on effects of school choice programs on outcomes such as criminal activity, character skills, mental health, and political participation. He has authored over 40 articles, book chapters, and reports on education policy, and is co-editor of the recently published book, School Choice Myths: Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. Corey, welcome back to Words and Numbers.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You were with us prior to COVID discussing school choice, public schools, private schools, charter schools. And so it's interesting to have you now post the age of COVID to talk about how COVID has influenced people's attitudes toward public and private education.
Before we get into how COVID has affected school choice, I want to just hit on how I would define school choice for people in the audience, because a lot of people get lost in the weeds in the debate about what it actually means to have school choice. And the way that I would reframe the conversation is to talk about it in terms of funding students directly, or funding students, not systems. And the way that I like to talk about in those terms is for a couple of reasons. One, it's more transparent. You understand exactly what I'm talking about. It's the idea that the money should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. That could be the residentially assigned government-run school if that works best for your child. But if not, you should be able to take your child's education dollars to a private school, a charter school, which is also defined as a public school on paper, or some other type of home-based instruction, including micro schools or pandemic pods that we've seen over the past year. The money should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. The other benefit in terms of talking about it with funding students directly is that it puts the other side on defense right away. If you say fund students, not systems, the enemies of any change to the status quo, the defenders of the monopolistic system, are in a weird situation to where if they want to argue with you, they have to try to figure out a way to make a compelling case as to why we should fund the buildings and not the kids directly. And then third, it's easy to point out the logical inconsistency of the other side when you talk about programs that fund people as opposed to buildings. Because a lot of the same people that support funding individuals as opposed to institutions only get all up in arms about it when it comes to those in-between years of K through 12 education. For example, with higher education, we have Pell Grants and the GI Bill, where the money goes to the student and they can rightfully choose a public or private, religious or non-religious university that works for them. Same thing with pre-K programs. Think about the federal Head Start program. The money doesn't go straight to a residentially assigned, government-run provider of pre-K services. Instead, the money goes to the families, and they can choose public, private, religious, or non-religious providers of pre-K services. You can continue the analogy with so many other industries in the U.S., including groceries. We have food stamps, where it would be absolutely absurd if food stamp funding had to be used at a residentially assigned, government-run grocery store. Instead, the money goes to the family. You can see the recurring theme here, that the funding can follow the family's decision to Walmart or Trader Joe's or Harris Teeter or Safeway. And all I'm arguing is that we should apply the same logic to K through 12 education. And this raises the question, why would people only oppose funding individuals as opposed to buildings only when it comes to the in-between years of K through 12 education? And the short answer is that there's a difference in power dynamics, that choice is the norm with higher education and pre-K and just about any other industry in the United States. But choice threatens an entrenched special interest only when it comes to those K through 12 years of education. And so they fight as hard as possible against any change to the status quo because they want to protect their monopoly at the expense of millions of families. And we've seen that more than ever over the past year. And I think that's why the silver lining of the past year and a half with COVID-19 and school shutdowns has been that there's a renewed fight for educational freedom because parents don't want to feel powerless like they did over the past year and a half ever again. So the latest Real Clear Opinion research polling on the topic has actually found a 10 percentage point jump in support for school choice, or what I would call funding students, not systems, with 64% support of school choice in April of 2020 to 74% support of school choice in June of 2021. And the biggest jumps were among families who had kids in the public school system and among Democrats as well. They saw about a 12 percentage point jump, with about 70% of Democrats supporting school choice now.
You said something early on, and I want to get back to it just for a second or two. When I moved to Pennsylvania, a weird thing happened. We chose a virtual charter school for our children. And they said, okay, great, you're enrolled, and we're going to take all the tax dollars that would have gone to your local school, and we're going to send them here, and that'll cover you. And it covered everything. They would send the books, they would send all the scientific apparatus, everything we needed to do a pretty good job of educating our children. What ended up happening was my children did go, and every year, like clockwork, the local principal of whatever school they would have been in wrote me a letter asking me to reconsider. So you got a little bit of vision of what the competition would look like. And I'm wondering if there are any other states that do this. This isn't perfect school choice, but it's better.
Yeah, so something that Anthony was kind of pointing out that I would like to clarify is that charter schools on paper are defined in every state that I've seen as public schools. And in a sense, they're actually more public than the traditional government-run schools in a lot of cases because they don't discriminate by zip code. In a lot of places, you are residentially assigned to one government-run school, and if you want to go somewhere else, tough luck. You have to move houses or you have to pay out of pocket, essentially paying twice to afford private school tuition and fees. So in a lot of senses, the public charter schools are more public than the traditional schools. And there have been some instances where parents have actually gone to jail trying to get their kids into better quote-unquote public schools because they lied about their address to try to get their kids into a better opportunity, which is a huge injustice that I think all sides of the political spectrum have figured out, that there is a problem in the current system. I think we disagree about how to fix that problem. I think the best solution and the only realistic solution is to essentially get rid of those district lines and allow families to choose any type of public school, to make them true public schools. And it shouldn't just be limited to government-run schools, too. You should be able to take that money to a private school as well. And charter schools sometimes get a little bit confused in the debate because they're defined as public schools. They can be pretty regulated by the government, but they also can be independently operated too. So they're kind of a quasi-public-private entity. I think that's why there's a lot of confusion in the debate. But going back to Pennsylvania, there are some cases where the public schools do up their game, the government-run schools, in response to competition because families start to be able to vote with their feet. And so the traditional schools start to think about how they allocate resources. There actually have been 5 studies that I've seen on the topic that I wrote about at the Washington Examiner in a post called School Choice Benefits Teachers Too, that find that either charter school or private school competition leads to higher teacher salaries in the public school system. Again, because the monopoly, their employer, starts to have better incentives to cater to the employees' needs and to funnel more money into the classroom. And then also in Pennsylvania, the thing is that there's rent seeking that happens as well to squash competition. In some places, you have the district being the only authorizer of whether a new charter school can open, which is a huge conflict of interest, obviously. Just imagine if McDonald's got to decide whether a Burger King was allowed to open in its vicinity in the future. It's essentially what you have in some states where the district system gets to decide whether a charter school can open and compete with them, which is a huge problem in some places. But in Pennsylvania, we're talking a little bit about the effects of the COVID pandemic. And I think one of the reasons why we've seen so much support for educational freedom over the past year and a half, one is parents don't want to feel powerless ever again. 2, parents have started to realize that there isn't any good reason to fund closed buildings when you can fund the students directly instead. If your grocery store closed down, it was kind of inconvenient, right? But at the end of the day, you didn't have to continue paying for those closed buildings. You were able to take your money to a competing provider of the service. And I think more people started to realize that maybe we should be able to do that with education too. If the building's closed, why are they still getting my child's education dollars? But in Pennsylvania, right when the schools closed in March of 2020, the teachers' unions overplayed their hand and showed everybody their true colors, that they prioritized the desires of the system over the needs of thousands of families at the worst time possible. The Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators actually lobbied to the government to make it illegal to switch to virtual charter schools. Now, why would they do that? It's because, and they admitted this in the news as well, that they understood that families were seeing that virtual charter schools were a valid option because they had been providing virtual education for decades. Whereas the traditional schools, they were either overregulated and could not figure it out in time. They couldn't adapt to change. They didn't have an incentive to adapt to the parents' needs. And it was just a last minute thing. They couldn't get it done in time. And so they lobbied to make it illegal to switch. They didn't get exactly what they wanted, but they did influence policy to make it to where the child's education dollars wouldn't follow them to a charter school. So technically it was legal to switch to a virtual charter school during the pandemic, but it made it as hard as possible for those charter schools to economically make it feasible to accept those students. They essentially punished charter schools for doing the right thing. Oregon did something similar. Their teachers' unions lobbied to the government to make it illegal to switch to virtual charter schools, but they were successful in doing so, and it was actually illegal. And Wall Street Journal actually wrote about this, and this was in March of 2020. The Oregon Education Association blocked at least 1,000 students in just a couple of days from switching to one charter school, Oregon Connections Academy. And so families started to see that the system doesn't really care all that much about them or their kids.
I want to go back to this idea of choice, but expand it a bit. James and I go to high schools throughout the country, probably 100 a year, giving lectures on economics and government. And we've found, not in every case, but in so many cases, the best teachers, and these are public school teachers, are also teachers who are in favor of school choice. And in talking to them, and you're asking, what would make your life better as a teacher? What could make your product better? Invariably, they say they want more control over the curriculum. And it kind of opened our eyes to this idea of choice, that if you think about school choice, it's not just parents choosing a school, it's the teacher choosing the curriculum rather than having it imposed. And you can go a step further. It's principals choosing which teachers to promote and to reward rather than promotions and rewards being based on some formula. Can you speak to that broader vision of choice?
I will say the best argument for choice is not about the employees. It's about the kids and the families and their needs. But it also turns out that school choice benefits teachers as well, which I pointed out. There's 5 studies linking school choice competition to better teacher salaries. Just think about the basic economic concepts that competition in the market for goods and services is great for customers. We all knew that already. But at the same time, competition in the labor market is good for employees. In the current system, there's essentially something called a monopsony, where there's one big employer, that's the government school system when it comes to K-12 education. And so teachers don't have much of a choice in the labor market right now when it comes to K-12 education in most states. And so if you introduce more competition in the labor market, that should lead to more autonomy for teachers and better benefits as well. And we've seen that play out with the limited evidence that we do have on the topic. And just think about the incentives of the teachers' unions, which are not all that aligned with the incentives of the teachers. What I've pointed out before is that we saw a lot of the problems with the school system over the past year and a half, where we had private schools fighting to reopen and charter schools fighting to reopen, and then the government schools and the teachers' unions fighting to remain closed. And you can look at that in a couple of ways. I think the main difference is one of incentives, that one of those sectors gets your money regardless of whether they open their doors for business. So, of course, the private schools understood and the charter schools understood that the parents could vote with their feet and go elsewhere. So they had to provide a service that was meaningful to families. And there were several lawsuits in different states that were pushed forward by private schools whenever their governors were closing the private schools and not allowing them to provide services to their customers. But then the unions in all the states, they were happy with the decision. And one example in particular stood out to me in California. Governor Newsom closed the public and the private schools, right? Even though at one point when the private schools were allowed to open, he was sending his kids to private school in-person instruction, but then he was okay with the public schools being closed for in-person instruction. Then he was actually caught in a press conference or something at one point where he was complaining about Zoom school, even though that's not what his kid was subject to at the time. But there was one Catholic school in Sacramento County where they had a county-level mandate that said that if you were a school, you could not be open for in-person services. But if you were a daycare, it was okay. The public schools were okay with that. The teachers' unions were happy with that decision. But this Catholic school in Sacramento actually rebranded itself as a daycare to get around the ridiculous regulations that were arbitrary, right? Which raises the question, if it's safe enough to provide in-person services for daycare, why isn't it safe enough if education is going on? In so many other states, including in North Carolina, for example, you had public school buildings that were closed for in-person services, but then they were charging families for daycare services in the same public school buildings.
Wow.
Well, if it was safe enough to do the in-person childcare in the same buildings, why wasn't it okay to go back to work and teach in person? What was actually happening was they had private sector employees coming into the public school buildings, and families had to pay through the property taxes for the public sector employees who were staying at home. But then they had to pay out of pocket for the childcare services for the private sector employees, essentially paying for 2 people to do the same job. I did hear a lot of stories of public school teachers that did want to go back to in-person services. And so why were the schools still remaining closed, even if a lot of the members of the teachers' unions wanted to be back in person? A lot of them wanted to see the kids again. But at the same time, you have to think about the incentives of the union that aren't aligned with the individual members. And in this case, the unions understood that they could hold children's educations hostage to leverage for more funding from the federal government, because they could say, well, we're not open because we need more money. And they were actually quite successful in that case, in that they have already gotten $190 billion from Congress since March of 2020, which turns out to be $3,000 or $4,000 per student in the public school system. And essentially none of that money was contingent upon actually reopening the schools for in-person instruction. In the American Rescue Plan, there was an amendment in the Senate that failed on a 50-50 vote that pretty much just said that the money would be contingent upon actually reopening the schools. It's COVID relief money. It should actually be based on whether you actually use that to reopen the schools for in-person learning, and it failed on a 50-50 partisan vote in the Senate. While the teachers may have wanted to go back, the union bosses knew that they could leverage the hardship of the families to get more resources. And this is one of the main problems with the traditional system, right? It's not the people in the system. It's the incentives that are all backwards in the current system. And the way that I've put it so many times is that underperforming private and charter schools shut down. Underperforming government schools get more money.
Yeah.
It's not just that they could keep their doors closed and continue to receive the same amount of funding. It's that they understood they could keep their doors closed and use that to get even more money because they could use that as an argument as to why they needed more money. If everything's going great, it's kind of hard to be in a position to argue in the public sector as to why you need more funding. And between 1992 and 2014, Ben Scafferty from Kennesaw State University has outlined some trends nationwide on this. Per pupil education expenditures in the U.S. increased by about 27% after adjusting for inflation over that time. But teacher salaries in real terms dropped by 2%. Whenever there's an increase in funding, most of it doesn't go towards teacher salaries. It goes towards putting more people into the buildings and putting it towards administrative bloat, which is great for union bosses because that means more dues-paying members. If they were to allocate those resources towards higher salaries, that wouldn't be as good of a benefit for the union bosses because you don't get the same return on union dues unless you put more people into the system. And we're seeing that right now in individual school districts, including Los Angeles public schools.
Sure, and that's showing up not just in the money, but in terms of the votes. The more people there are, the more union members, the more votes there are, and so the more political clout the union has.
Yeah, and the latest example of this is Los Angeles public schools. Some of the biggest headlines came out in Reason Magazine and other places pointing out that in their report to safely reopen schools in 2020, they were including all these political demands. They wanted Medicare for all, a wealth tax, defunding the police. They wanted to get rid of standardized testing. On a couple of occasions, they band together with the Democratic Socialists of America on at least 2 occasions to hold national days of resistance to demand safe schools, where in that case, they also provided all these political demands to cancel rent and to end foreclosures, a lot of these things that had nothing to do with reopening the school safely. They overplayed their hands there and gave away the game. Families started to see that this doesn't make any sense. And a lot of teachers union members, too, who just wanted their benefits in terms of legal protections and in terms of their retirement benefits. They became unhappy with how the unions were really including all these political demands over the past year and a half. Los Angeles public schools have reported numbers just the other day that they've lost 6% of their school enrollment. Parents are voting with their feet even without school choice. There's a mass exodus from the public school system. Nationwide, 1.5 million students have left the traditional system, whereas charter schools have increased their enrollment by about 7.1%. Homeschooling has at least tripled, but in Los Angeles, they've lost 6% of their school-age population in the government school system.
It's astounding when you think about it. In effect, you can't give away a free product.
Yeah. You're not charging directly in terms of tuition, right? Even though it costs a lot of money indirectly through taxes. They're estimating that even though their customer base is decreasing by 6%, and it has been each and every year, they've been losing thousands of students. This isn't new, but it's much higher than usual this particular year. But they're planning to increase the amount of teachers in the system by 8%, the amount of custodial workers by 25%, and the amount of psychological social workers by about 80%. So again, we're seeing this recurring trend of it's a jobs program for adults, not so much an education system for kids.
You mentioned earlier a gentleman who was in the administration, but his child didn't go to public school. I got to tell you, your written work is outstanding, but your social media work is hilarious.
Yeah.
Because you find these people over and over and over again. It's like one a week. How do you dig them up?
Well, sometimes it's already public knowledge. So, for example, one of the most recent has to do with the Virginia governor's race. Terry McAuliffe, who was the former governor of Virginia, sent his kids to private school. He exclusively attended private school, which is great. Every family should seek out the best options for their kids. But he vetoed 3 school choice bills in 2016 when he was governor, and he came out on CNN on Sunday saying, in regards to school choice, that I will never allow that to happen as governor. So there's a lot of school choice hypocrisy when it comes to this debate, this idea of school choice for me, but not for thee. And yes, this happens over and over again. And one of the biggest finds that I found myself was with Elizabeth Warren during the Democratic primaries in 2019. She had said over and over again she was a proud product of public schools, and it's true that she attended public schools in Oklahoma, but she was silent on where she sent her kids. I dug up using Ancestry.com that she sent her kid to a private school in Pennsylvania and in Austin, which again is great, but don't try to fight against other families from having the same kinds of opportunities, which brings me to another point that Advantaged families are already more likely to have school choice, right? They can afford to live in the best neighborhoods, assigned to the best public schools. They're more likely to be able to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. Funding students directly allows more families to have access to these alternatives. And in that sense, school choice is an equalizer.
Corey, thank you for coming and talking with us. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. It's at DeAngelis Corey. So follow me on Twitter if you're not already. But at the same time, if you want to help in the fight to fund students, not systems, you can also go to fundstudentsnotsystems.org.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corey. That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, show notes are right there for you. You can find out all kinds of things like links from the stories and the Words and Numbers Backstage Facebook group, our Twitter handles.
And our email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
It's astonishing how chipper you get when you say these stupid things.
I love email,
that get
James.
all kinds of people saying things to us every week. I think maybe people are looking at winter in a foreboding sort of way. And although, Ann, I got to tell you, I was up in Massachusetts last week, and the turning of the leaves was something I had forgotten all about, and it was just stunning.
Well, that's nice that somebody has it. Here in Pennsylvania, we went from green to brown, completely bypassing all the colors.
I've been out of the Northeast for well over 25 years. Going back and having leisure to sit there and just look at it all was really something. Did a lot of good for my tortured soul. Along with that, they should probably be nice to each other. I'll see you next week, yeah?
See you next week, James.